Alright, I'm hiding the moves again because I don't want to spoil anything, but I wanted to talk about how I lose games in the Rubinstein French, because there is a theme, especially when I'm playing Blitz and Bullet, where I just blunder a lot, and I just make this mistake, and I've made it a lot, and sometimes it's not quite the mistake it looks like and you can get out, so I'm going to show examples which aren't necessarily devastating, but I want to show the most common tactical error I make in this opening. And I think it's really easy to fall into if you're not being careful. I know I've fallen into it on a video I showed that my opponent didn't spot the move. But there is this tactic I concede quite a lot. So we're zooming through the opening moves, but we trade off one pair of knights, we play c5, we take on d4, we cannot take the knight due to bishop b5 check, winning our queen. So instead we attack the knight again. When the knight goes to b3, it can no longer harass our bishop on d6, so the bishop comes back to d6. Now bishop e7 is a slight mistake, but this is for example purposes. The bishop is much more active on d6. We don't actually need it to deal with this pin, as we've seen black has other ways to deal with the pin, often by sidestepping. Queen e2, castles, this all looks very normal. Bishop g5, and here's the position where black can screw up really badly. And black's position's already a little unpleasant. The bishop should be on d6, not e7. Maybe h6 should be played. But the kind of mistake I often make is to play b6 here. And here's the problem. This bishop gives white targets on h7. For the moment, there's problems on this diagonal too. The only thing stopping queen e4 is this knight on f6. White can take, black takes back, and queen e4 wins the game. I cannot save mate and the rook on a8. And I do blunder this a lot, and so we should be careful. If we have castled, we don't have a super stable knight on f6, then often b6 is scary because of a queen e4 idea. So let's look at other versions. What if we had played bishop d6? And played exactly the same. Now does b6 lose? Well, it's not good. I think here black can play queen c7, maybe h6. Black has other moves they can play. But it's not as losing as it was before. Now, if queen takes f6, queen e4, this looks busted. But let's think. What can black do? Can black make a counter threat? And here they can. Queen h6 hitting h2, and because this is checkmate, black will have time to save the rook. So this one's actually okay for black. Black is better here, in fact. But white has a better move. White can play bishop takes h7 first, and then play queen e4 check, and then grab on a8. Now black can get the exchange back. There's a discovery on the queen, and attacking the rook. But white's going to take so many pawns that this position, they're hitting the bishop, they're currently up 2 pawns. Black will get 1 back, but oh, white's better here. White's a bit better. So b6 allowing bishop f6 and bishop takes h7 check, and white's better. Again, we should just be scary about castling and having this rook on a8 without the bishop on b7 yet. And this is one of the reasons when we play b6, we should often just follow it with bishop b7. We probably shouldn't play b6 and then, say, c5 in a bunch of positions. We should just get the bishop on b7 as quick as we can after playing b6. So let's go back earlier. So say knight f3. We're going to look at a few more versions of this trick. Castles, bishop g5, b6, queen e2. So we often want to play bishop b7. And I was thinking, if we play h6 here, we have the same problem, right? Queen f6, queen e4, mate on h7, rook on a8. But actually, black can make it a little tricky. gf6, queen f4, f5, queen here, queen c7, and black's threatening bishop b7, queen takes a7, because the rook opens up on the queen, and then b5, this move, will trap the queen. The queen has no squares. a6 is covered by the bishop, a5 by the queen, a4 by the pawn, a3 by the bishop, and the bishop attacks the queen. Okay, that's a hideous mess of arrows, but you get the idea. Black is actually threatening to trap the queen. And white only really has one good way out, which is quite surprising. So practically, though black is lost here, the white player has to find bishop e4 to extricate their queen. Once they do, yep, white's up in exchange and a pawn, white is winning. Black has some compensation in the 2 bishops, but white is definitely winning. So again, h6 falls for this. Instead, bishop b7, very logical, rook a1. And now we don't have time for something like h6 because of bishop h7. That's not h7, winning the queen. So queen c7, and we've seen this before. But I guess my thing to watch out for is really, pay attention. When this bishop's on g5, they can often get rid of our key defender of e4, and if we don't have bishop b7 in yet, they'll have this queen e4 fork. And once they play it, we shouldn't resign on the spot. Sometimes when they play bishop f6, we should take back gf6 and then try to trap their queen when it comes to a8, because we control all these squares on the diagonal, because our f5 pawn will control one, the e6 pawn will control another, and sometimes we have some chance to trap their queen. And in the other line, with the bishop on d6, we survive this because we have this queen h6 maneuver and we hit h2. So the more actively we've placed our pieces, the better chance we have to survive. Our bishop's better on d6 than e7. But I've lost to this a bunch, and I thought I should mention it. I'd also like to talk a little more about just themes in the Rubinstein in this video. There is a wonderful book by Jan Markos called Under the Surface, where he talks about some stuff that might sound a little basic, but he's really getting at deeper understandings of it. And he talks about what a piece does. And I don't want to take too much material from him because his book's great and you should check it out. But he says a piece is worth considering on 3 fronts: activity, stability, and as a piece of wood. Now, activity. If we look at the advanced French, or most Frenches, this bishop's stuck. This bishop is clearly inactive. It's stuck in, it's not going to do much, and that's why black so often looks to trade it off. This is an inactive bishop. But it is a stable bishop. White's not going to chase it. It's not vulnerable. It might get in the way a little. Maybe we want a rook on c8. As a piece of wood means does it get in the way of squares your other pieces need. Just as it exists on the board, it's just there, right? It's a piece of wood. It's getting in the way of other things potentially. Now, some of our pieces aren't getting in the way of things. Say our knight came to h6. No other piece wants to come to h6. Maybe, let's say we don't want to move our h-pawn or whatever. Just in any position. It doesn't have to be this one. There are lots of squares that don't get in the way, and there are other squares where you might have this wonderful outpost and your bishop's there, but actually a knight there would just be much better, and the bishop as a piece of wood is getting in the way. Even if that bishop itself seems like a good piece, it is a bad piece because it is blocking another piece from getting to that useful square. So okay, we have an example of an inactive bishop. Now what about the Caro-Kann? One of the points of the Caro-Kann is you can play this d5 move countering the center, much like the French, but you don't block your bishop in. So surely this bishop is now good. But Jan Markos will tell you this is still not a great bishop. Now it is an active bishop, it has a much better diagonal, but it is not a stable bishop. And there are lots of lines, for instance knight c3, e6, where the bishop gets chased a lot. Knight g2 to f4 is coming, h4, h5. But there are lots of lines in the Caro-Kann. There's also lines here where the bishop comes out to f5, but it's going to get chased. Knight g3 is going to come. Now knight e2 and f4 is still possible. h4, h5 is more common. Black's going to have to make moves like h6 or h5 to give the bishop a square. The bishop is vulnerable on the light squares. It's going to get chased. It is not stable, and black will have to make extra moves just to keep it eventually reach a stable square on h7, at which point white will usually trade their bishop for it. So the bishop in the Caro-Kann may be active, but it is not actually stable. It's often quite vulnerable to attacks. I'd like to add a fourth, which you might consider included in the somewhere between activity and stability: redundancy. Black's pawns are all going to be on the light squares. Black's going to have good control of the light squares, right? This bishop is often going to be controlling squares that black already has a lot of control over, while the other bishop is controlling squares that otherwise black has quite a lot of difficulty controlling. So I would say the bishop is also somewhat redundant. If we compare our bishops, this one's the redundant bishop. I clicked the wrong one, but this one. And so this is still our bad bishop, even though we haven't blocked it in, because it is less stable and more redundant than our good bishop. So if we think about these principles, activity, stability, As a piece of wood, is it getting in the way? And redundancy, we can think about our openings, which pieces are good, and which pieces would we be happier to trade. So if we go to the Rubinstein French, and I know I've talked about this before, but in this position, our knights have a really good square on f6. But there's only one f6. The other squares the knights can go to just aren't that active. Knight c6 as a piece of wood gets in the way of our key break. Always be c5ing. Can't do that with knight c6. Knight a6, not stable. Our pawns are going to get ruined or, threaten to be ruined at various points. Knight d7 as a piece of wood might kind of get in the way of our queen and bishop. Probably not, but I think the bigger problem is it's just not that active. It just doesn't control squares that are as important as these two that a knight on f6 controls. Knight on f6 is an active, and it's a pretty stable square. We can reinforce it really well. White can't chase it with the e-pawn because their e-pawn's been traded off. And as we've seen from looking at a lot of lines, white never really pushes g4, g5. I've had it played against me. It's just not good. It's not threatening. So the knight on f6 is stable, and it's active. And it doesn't get in the way of other pieces, except it gets in the way of our other knight because not both knights can occupy it. Thus, it makes so much sense to trade off one pair of knights and have the other occupy it. This bishop controls a lot of squares we otherwise have trouble controlling. This is a pretty good bishop. We like it. Whichever knight ends up on f6, we love that knight and would like to trade the other one. If we keep both knights on, we should really think maybe about knight d5 and bring the other knight to f6, because perhaps d5 is a good square. But note, it's not as stable. It can be driven away. And then our last piece is the c8 bishop. And it's a bad piece right now. It's very inactive. So we play b6 and bishop b7 to get it active. At that point, it is somewhat active, though as we've seen, this diagonal is not as good as it looks, though it was in the game we just looked at. So it is somewhat active. It is stable, but as a piece of wood, it often gets in the way of b-file play. And it turns out not to be as active as you'd think. And it also, our knight on f6 has wonderful control of the d5 and e4 squares, and can use them to get at useful queenside squares. We've seen pressure on c3. The game we just looked at, has a win on c3 when I did the Hansen-Meyer game in the Rubinstein French, where the winning tactic was the knight coming to c3. So this bishop will often be willing to trade. One pair of knights is great to trade. And I know I've talked about this over and over, but I think it's so interesting to look at your openings and think about kind of which pieces are your good and bad ones, which ones do you want to trade. And white's knights are really good. The knight e5 is a nice square for the knight, potentially. This knight is nice and centralized, so we're fighting it immediately. And one reason we might give up the bishop so easily is just because this knight on e5 is just a very good knight, and thus we might be happy to just trade for it first. So just thinking about which pieces you want to trade just remains fascinating to me. And I think the Rubinstein French, while not the greatest of openings, is a really good example of an opening where it's pretty clear to figure out, and what you figure out is going to be true in most lines, because the pawn structure is pretty similar in most lines of this opening. And different pawn structures are going to change which pieces are good and which pieces are bad, which makes decisions with pawns incredibly important. The Rubinstein French, we treat our pawns very similarly every game, and thus which pieces are good and bad is going to stay pretty constant. Alright, so this was my 4th video on the Rubinstein French. There's going to be one more where I just ram through some theory, and hopefully with all this talk of themes and ideas, the theory will then make sense and stick a bit better.